There are stories that begin in a place so far away that, when you stand there and look around, all you can see is an endless horizon of wild grass and steppe wind. A place where, on cold winter mornings, the sun hangs like a red disk in the gray sky and the beating of horse hooves sounds like the heartbeat of an entire people. It is the homeland of those whom history calls the Turks. Yet their journey, the truth about them, and the question of who they really are far more complex than a single name. We often think of the Turks through familiar images, the blue domes of Istanbul, the strong aroma of mocha, or the legendary stories of Ottoman warriors. But only a few know that their traces stretch from the glacial rivers of Siberia to the sunny coasts of the Mediterranean across thousands of kilometers, and that they carried with them a cultural treasure woven from dozens of peoples and centuries of migration. They were not only steppe warriors, but also storytellers, merchants, craftsmen, and sometimes blood brothers of the very peoples they once faced on the battlefield. And if I now tell you that many Turks on the coasts share up to 30% of their genetic heritage with the Greeks, would you be surprised? Today we will take a journey from the icy Altai Mountains, regarded as the original homeland, to the lively streets of modern Istanbul. We will explore the true meaning of the name Turk, get to know the great family of Turkic peoples, hear the stories of empires that rose and fell, and, with the help of genetic facts, find out who they really are. And now let us begin where everything had its origin, in a harsh steppe where the wind carries the sound of hooves and dreams of the west. When we look far to the east, to where the gentle lines of the steppe end in the sharp contours of mountain ranges, we come upon a landscape that seems unchanged for thousands of years. Endless plains beneath a sky that glows deep blue or pale gray depending on the season, interrupted only by the white peaks of the Altai and Sayan mountains. In this barren yet majestic expanse between the Altai, the Urals, the Tian Shan mountains in the east, and the Altun mountains in the south lay, according to current research, the original homeland of the Turkic peoples. Historians describe this region as a mosaic of steppes, river valleys, and high plateaus that, on the one hand, imposed harsh living conditions on its people, but on the other, fostered exactly the mobility and resilience that would later become defining characteristics of the Turkic tribes. It was a world in which life was determined by the rhythm of the seasons and the herds. Nomadic pastoralism was not merely an economic system, but a cultural core. Anyone born here learned early how to mount a horse, handle a bow and arrow, and make what was necessary out of very little. Yet as enduring as this way of life seemed, it was never safe from external threats. From the east came pressure from peoples such as the Shungu, later the Ruran, and other mounted nomads. From the south, the fertile oases of Central Asia beckoned, and from the west, trade routes and wealthy cities offered opportunity. This position between centers of power and natural barriers made the steppe a melting pot, but also a transit zone in which peoples came, went, and mixed. Archaeological finds show that various tribal confederations already existed here in the 3rd century, which we today describe as Proto-Turkic. Around this core gathered other groups, including the so-called Eastern Huns, the Tabgach, the Hun Shah, and the Proto-Mongolic Ruran. Chinese annals mention these tribes not only as threats, but also as trading partners, which shows that the steppe was not an isolated space but part of a far-reaching cultural exchange. The construction of the Great Wall under Qin Shi Huang was not only an act of defense, but also a silent admission of the power of these horse peoples. In the year 552, the first state organization that can clearly be assigned to the Turkic tribes emerged with the Göktürk Khaganate. This empire stretched from the Khingan Mountains to Transoxiana, though it soon split into an eastern and a western part. The Western Turks, also called the people of the 10 tribes, advanced as far as Herat and fought wars against the Persian Sassanids. In 659, their realm too was absorbed into the Chinese Empire, but uprisings followed. In 683, the leader Kutlug of the Ashina clan succeeded in uniting various tribes once again and founding the Second Turkic Khaganate, an empire that, despite its brief existence, remained a strong symbol of the political agency of the steppe. This early history is more than a sequence of wars and changes of power. It shows how a harsh environment, a strategic location, and constant movement shaped a people that could not be forced into fixed borders. Anyone who wants to understand the original homeland of the Turks must see the steppe not only as a geographical space, but as a living organism, a place that grants both hardship and freedom. And from exactly this cradle began the next stage of a journey that would change world history, the great migrations that led the Turks out of their homeland and brought them step by step closer to the Mediterranean. If the steppe was the cradle of the Turkic peoples, then the great migrations were their heartbeat, an unceasing rhythm of departure, encounter, and transformation. Hardly any other people in Eurasian history left their mark across such vast distances as the Turks. The reasons for this movement lay deep within the structures of their lives. The nomadic economic system required constant adaptation to climate and grazing land, and political tensions between rival tribes or pressure from outside repeatedly forced them onto new routes. Yet every migration was more than mere retreat. It opened new horizons, brought contact with foreign cultures, and slowly shaped an identity that was no longer tied to one single place. As early as the 6th and 7th centuries, internal conflicts within the Göktürk realm and pressure from powerful neighbors caused individual groups to move westward. Through the Central Asian oasis cities along the Silk Road trade routes, they reached regions where Iranian, Sogdian, and later Islamic influences awaited them. These encounters shaped their language, clothing, craftsmanship, and, not least, their religion. In the 8th and 9th centuries, new waves of migration followed, partly triggered by the rise of the Uyghurs and partly by the pressure of the Kyrgyz, who themselves were moving before other peoples. Particularly decisive for later history was the migration of the Oghuz, who from the 8th century onward moved from the regions of present-day Mongolia and Kazakhstan into Transoxiana. There they encountered the world of the Persian-speaking cultural sphere, learned new forms of state organization, and adopted numerous words and concepts. When parts of the Oghuz converted to Islam in the 10th century, this was not merely a religious decision, but a crucial step that integrated them into the political and cultural world of the Middle East. With the rise of the Seljuks in the 11th century, the Turkic peoples finally reached the Near East. The Seljuks, themselves an Oghuz tribe, advanced into Anatolia with military strength and political skill. Their victory over the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 opened the way for a lasting Turkish presence in Asia Minor. Compared with earlier conquerors, their success was not due to the sword alone, but also to their ability to adopt local structures, form alliances with non-Turkic groups, and integrate themselves into existing economic and trade networks. From that point on, the road to the Mediterranean was no longer just a geographical direction, but a cultural destination. The Turkish tribes that had set out from the steppes of Central Asia now found themselves in a world where olive groves, vineyards, and coastal cities shaped everyday life. They brought with them their horsemanship, their nomadic traditions, and their military organization, but they also absorbed architectural forms, culinary habits, and craft techniques from their new homeland. This mutual interpenetration gradually turned the newcomers from strangers into integral parts of a complex society. In retrospect, these migrations resemble a vast current that, over centuries, slowly but irresistibly made its way forward. It connected the icy steppes of the Altai with the warm shores of the Aegean Sea and thus created a space in which the heritage of Asia and Europe merged in a unique way. Yet to understand the Turks as a people, it is not enough merely to know their roots. One must also understand what they called themselves and what they were called by others. Sometimes a name reveals more about a history than any monument. It carries memories, interpretations, and misunderstandings that have grown over centuries. The name Turk is one such case, seemingly simple, yet its origin leads us deep into the early age of the Eurasian steppe, into diplomatic reports of ancient empires, myths, and political decisions that still shape the sound of this word today. The earliest written testimonies come from the 6th century and are found in Chinese sources in which a tribal confederation is referred to as Tuju. Older transcriptions reflect the difficulty of rendering the sounds of a foreign language into one's own writing system. For the Han Chinese, Turk was initially an external designation, an ethnonym for a militarily significant group perceived on their northern and western frontiers. Interestingly, the exact meaning of the word has never been conclusively clarified. In later Turkic languages, it was often translated as powerful or strong, which on the one hand reflects the pride and self-image of those who bore it, and on the other hand the image their neighbors had of them. In Western Turkology, there are different explanatory approaches. Some derive Turk from the Old Turkic verb meaning to arise or come into being, an image that recalls the emergence of a tribe from a source. The Russian Orientalist Vasily Bartold, on the other hand, emphasized the proximity to a word meaning custom, tradition, or law, and thus viewed the term more culturally than ethnically. More distant still is the hypothesis of a Tibetan origin. This range of interpretations shows how closely language, identity, and outside perception were intertwined in the early history of the Turks. The Old Turkic word kuk, pronounced guk in modern Turkish due to a sound shift, means blue or sky. In the color orientation of nomads, blue stood for east, so that the Guk Turks can literally be understood as the Turks of the East. The Arabic designation Turkiya reached Italy in the Middle Ages and was often used in European sources as a collective term for Muslim powers of the Orient, regardless of their ethnic composition. Thus, in 18th-century Vienna, not only ethnic Turks but also Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, or Jews from the Ottoman Empire were casually described as Turks, often recognizable by their clothing, which abroad sometimes appeared even more oriental than at home. In the Balkans, Turk in turn acquired a religious meaning. Christians used it to describe all Muslims, whether Bosnians, Albanians, or actual Ottomans. In the core lands of the Ottoman Empire itself, however, the term long carried a somewhat derogatory tone and was used more for peasants and craftsmen. Members of the Ottoman elite would hardly have described themselves as Turks, but rather identified through their religious and administrative affiliation. This complexity shows that the name Turk is far more than a fixed ethnic term. It is a mirror of political, social, and cultural transformation in which self-images and outside perceptions flow into one another. Whoever uses it often says just as much about their own perspective as about those they are referring to. But names alone do not explain a people. To understand who the Turks really are, we must look at their relatives, at that far-flung community of around 40 peoples connected through language. Let us imagine looking at a huge map stretching from the icy expanses of Siberia to the warm coasts of the Mediterranean. Spread across this map we find a vast family, the Turkic peoples, around 40 ethnic groups connected by linguistic roots, yet shaped by very different landscapes, religions, and historical experiences. When people today speak of the Turks, they usually mean the citizens of the Republic of Turkey. Yet the Turks are only one branch on this widely spread family tree, whose roots run deep into the history of Central Asia. Among the Turkic peoples are the Altaians, Khakas, Yakuts, and Tuvans in distant Siberia, the Turkmens, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Uyghurs, and Karakalpaks in Central Asia, the Tatars, Bashkirs, and Chuvash in the Volga-Ural region, the Nogays and Crimean Tatars on the Black Sea, as well as the Azerbaijanis in the Caucasus region. This diversity shows that language can unite even when ways of life and historical paths differ greatly. Similarities in grammar, sound structure, and part of the vocabulary point to a common linguistic prehistory. Culturally, however, each of these groups has preserved its own traditions. Over the course of history, Political and cultural leadership among the Turkic peoples passed repeatedly from one group to another. At one time it was the Gökturks, then the Uyghurs, later the Seljuks, and finally the Ottomans. With the founding of the Republic in 1923, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk attempted to create a unified national identity, inspired by the French model of the citizen, according to which all citizens are equal regardless of ethnic origin. The Treaty of Lausanne, which internationally recognized the Republic, distinguished only between Muslims and non-Muslims. Armenians, Greeks, and Jews were recognized as national minorities. Everyone else was to be Turkish, regardless of their actual roots. Thus, in modern Turkey there live not only ethnic Turks but also Kurds, Laz, Circassians, Bosniaks, Arabs, and even descendants of African slaves who in the Aegean region are known as Afro-Turks. For the state, the term Turk symbolizes the unity of all citizens. Critics, however, see in this also a tendency toward cultural homogenization that pushes minorities into the background. Compared with other countries, it is striking that in Russia too many Turkic peoples such as Tatars or Bashkirs preserve their language and culture while being part of a multi-ethnic state. In Central Asia, by contrast, national identities were often formed along ethnic lines: Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, with Turkic as the background language family, but without the claim of a common Turkish nation. These differences show that being Turkish can take on very different meanings depending on context, an ethnic affiliation, a linguistic connection, or a civic identity. In Turkey, these levels merge, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes full of tension, into a complex mosaic. Yet to understand how this diversity came into being, we must return to the beginning, to those distant times when the Turkic peoples were not yet divided into nations, but moved through their original homeland as loose tribal confederations. If one imagines the early history of the Turkic peoples as a vast, constantly changing river, then the first great empires and alliances are like islands rising from that flow, places where power, culture, and identity condensed for a time before dissolving again into the current of history. The first of these centers of power was the Göktürk Khaganate, founded in 552 by the leader Bumin Khan. It was not only the first empire to bear the name Turk in its official title, but also a turning point. The Turkic peoples emerged from the shadow of smaller tribal confederations and formed a political unit that stretched from the Altai far into the west. The Göktürk Empire was distinguished by a remarkable ability for alliance building. It was not military strength alone that secured their power, but also the art of forming alliances with neighbors or changing loyalties at the right time. Nevertheless, after only a few decades the empire broke into an eastern and a western part. This was a weakness common to many nomadic empires, as personal loyalties often weighed more heavily than central authority. The eastern part fell under Chinese overlordship around 580, while the Western Turks, the people of the 10 tribes, remained independent somewhat longer and advanced as far as Herat, where they clashed militarily with the Sassanids. After a period of subordination to the Chinese Empire, Kutlug Khan of the powerful Ashina clan succeeded in 683 in reuniting the scattered tribes and founding the Second Turkic Khaganate. This realm lasted only until 744, but during that time the idea of a political unity of the Turks was strengthened. It was also the period in which the inscriptions along the Orkhon River appeared, the oldest known written testimonies in a Turkic language and still a cultural symbol to this day. With the fall of the Second Khaganate to the rising Uyghurs, a new epoch began. The Uyghurs, originally a confederation of 9 tribal groups, founded the Uyghur Khaganate, which lasted from 744 to 840. Unlike many of their predecessors, they relied not only on warfare, but also on trade and diplomacy. Their empire was strategically positioned along important trade routes, bringing them prosperity and cultural flourishing. The Uyghurs adopted and adapted elements of Sogdian and Chinese culture, including writing, religion, and administrative techniques. One can view them as bridge builders between the nomadic world of the steppe and the settled high cultures of Asia. Yet their rule too did not last forever. In 840 they were overthrown by the Kyrgyz, another Turkic people from the north. The Kyrgyz, famous for their adaptability in the harsh mountain and forest regions of Siberia, pushed deep into the Uyghur heartland. While part of the defeated Uyghurs migrated toward Gansu and Xinjiang, the Kyrgyz extended their power southward. Interestingly, despite this military success, the Kyrgyz were culturally less influential than the Uyghurs. This is an example of how political dominance does not automatically lead to cultural dominance. The succession of these empires shows a recurring pattern: rise through military strength and skillful diplomacy, followed by a phase of consolidation before external attacks or internal fragmentation led to decline. Yet each of these realms left traces in language, administration, religion, and cultural contact. These early centers of power formed the foundation on which later great Turkish empires such as those of the Seljuks and the Ottomans would build. Language is more than a tool of communication. It is a memory, a mirror of the paths a people has taken. In the case of the Turks, it carries in its sounds and words the traces of migrations across continents, encounters with foreign cultures, and political upheavals that reshaped entire societies. Anyone who wants to understand how modern Turkish developed from the voices of the steppe must go back to the oldest inscriptions of the Turkish peoples, the Orkhon inscriptions. These texts, carved in stone, found along the Orkhon River in present-day Mongolia, date from the 8th century and are considered the oldest surviving written testimony of a Turkic language. Their characters are angular and clear, and they speak of rulers, wars, and moral teachings. They prove that the nomadic empires were organized not only militarily but also culturally. Unlike many contemporary nomadic peoples, the Gökturks possessed their own written language, not borrowed from settled neighbors, but emerging from their own cultural world. With the migrations of the Oghuz and later the Seljuks, the center of the Turkish language shifted westward in the 10th and 11th centuries. In Transoxiana and Persia, Turkish absorbed numerous Persian loanwords, especially in administration, poetry, and everyday culture. With the adoption of Islam, Arabic terms were added, particularly in religion, science, and philosophy. These layers turned the language into a complex fabric in which Old Turkic structures met a rich vocabulary from the Near East. In the Ottoman Empire, this development reached its peak. Ottoman Turkish was a mixed language in which, depending on the type of text, up to 80% of the words could come from Arabic or Persian. While elites, administrators, scholars, and poets used this high language, the spoken Turkish of the people remained much closer to the original structure and vocabulary of the steppe. Thus, a linguistic divide emerged that marked not only education but also social belonging. The most radical turning point came in 1928, when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk pushed through the script reform. The Arabic alphabet was replaced by a Latin-based one, supplemented with additional letters to represent Turkish sounds accurately. Ataturk saw in this reform not only a modernization but also a means of increasing literacy and bringing the country closer to the West. At the same time, he initiated a language purification campaign. Arabic and Persian loanwords were to be replaced with newly coined Turkish terms. This renewal brought not only progress, but also ruptures. Millions of people had to learn the new script, and old documents became almost unreadable for the younger generation. Today, modern Turkish is the result of this long journey, from the runic inscriptions of the Orkhon stones, through the courtly language of Istanbul, to the clear lines of the Latin alphabet. Every age has left traces, and every turn, every loanword reflects a piece of history. But language is only one part of identity. To understand who the Turks are today, we must also look at what is not written in the dictionary, at their genetic and ethnic history. When we speak of history, we often speak of wars, rulers, alliances, and cultural achievements. Yet beneath this visible layer lies a deeper, quieter chronicle, inscribed in the genetic makeup of a people. The genes of today's Turks are like an invisible archive reporting on encounters, migrations, and mixtures across many centuries. Anyone who reads this genetic truth recognizes that the image of a purely Central Asian origin is too simple, and that the road from the steppe to the Bosporus is far more complex. The Turkification of Anatolia was not a sudden violent replacement of the population, but a process that unfolded over centuries. When the first Turkic-speaking nomadic groups arrived in Asia Minor in the Middle Ages, they encountered a rich mixture of peoples: Anatolian Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Iranian-speaking groups, Caucasian peoples, and descendants of the Hittites, Phrygians, and Lydians. These groups were not simply displaced, but gradually absorbed into a shared cultural and linguistic identity. One may compare this process with the Slavicization of the Balkans, or the Germanization of Central Europe. A relatively small incoming elite-shaped language, military organization and administration, while the majority of the population retained much of its genetic ancestry. This explains why people in Western Turkey today are often genetically closer to Greeks or Southern Italians than to Kazakhs or Kyrgyz, even though all belong to the Turkic language family. This genetic mosaic tells the story of a nation formed not through homogeneity, but through diversity. It is a mosaic in which every epoch, every alliance, and every migration added a new color. And precisely in this lies its special strength, the ability to absorb different influences and shape from them a stable identity of its own. Yet genes alone do not make a people. They are the foundation, but the building itself arises through history, culture, and common action. A decisive step on this path was the rise of the Oghurs and the Seljuks, those tribes that laid the groundwork for the Ottoman Empire and transformed the geographical and political map of the Middle East for centuries. When we shift our gaze from the vast steppe of Central Asia to the west, we see not only geographical distances, but also a development that would fundamentally reshape the political and cultural map of the Middle East. At the center of this movement stood the Oghuz, a Turkic-speaking tribal confederation that from the 8th century onward moved steadily toward Persia and Anatolia. They were nomads, but their path was far more than a flight from climatic or political pressures. It was an expansion born from adaptability, military organization, and the search for new living spaces. The Oghuz originally came from regions east of the Aral Sea and in what is now Kazakhstan. Their social structure was strongly tribal, yet flexible enough to absorb new members and alliances. When they established themselves in Transoxiana, the area between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, they entered a world shaped by Persian Islamic culture. Here they adopted not only military tactics, but also administrative practices and many elements of urban life. The decisive turning point came in the 10th century, when part of the Oghuz converted to Islam. This step opened the doors to new political alliances. From this environment emerged the Seljuk clan, named after their leader Seljuk Beg. His descendants first entered the service of Muslim rulers before becoming a dominant power themselves. Under Tugril Beg, a grandson of Seljuk, the Seljuks entered Baghdad in 1055 and received official recognition from the Abbasid Caliph. In this way they combined military power with religious legitimacy, a model that would later shape the Ottoman Empire as well. The Seljuks were not only conquerors, but also skillful organizers. They established an empire stretching from Khorasan through Persia to Anatolia. At the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they decisively defeated the Byzantine army and thereby opened Anatolia to a lasting Turkish presence. This victory had not only military but also psychological impact. Byzantine authority in the region was shaken, while numerous Turkic-speaking nomads poured into the fertile lands of Anatolia. The Sultanate of Rum, which emerged in the conquered parts of Anatolia, became a melting pot of Turkish, Persian, Byzantine, and Armenian culture. Trade and craftsmanship flourished, and cities such as Konya developed into centers of Islamic learning. At the same time, the Seljuks strengthened an administrative structure based on the ikia system, a form of land assignment to those bound to military service, which the Ottomans later adopted as well. Yet, as so often in the history of nomadic dynasties, a combination of internal power struggles and external threats led to decline. The Mongol invasion in the 13th century shattered Seljuk power, but it left behind a political vacuum in Anatolia. In that vacuum, numerous small principalities, so-called beyliks, emerged and competed for influence. Among them was also a small and unremarkable principality on the northwestern edge of Anatolia, led by a man named Osman. From this seed the Ottoman Empire would grow. At the beginning of one of the most powerful empires in world history stood neither an untouchable emperor nor a glittering capital, but a small frontier ruler in an inconspicuous region of northwestern Anatolia. Osman, the son of Ertugrul, ruled a comparatively modest beylik located at the meeting point between the collapsing Sultanate of Rum and the weakening Byzantine provinces. Yet precisely this position in a militarily and economically significant frontier zone would become his greatest advantage. Osman I began his rule around 1299 in a time of political fragmentation. The Seljuks had collapsed under Mongol blows, the Byzantines had lost large parts of Anatolia, and many regions were controlled by rival principalities. In this power vacuum, Osman began to strengthen his position through a mixture of military determination, diplomatic skill, and religious legitimacy. Like many other frontier lords of the time, he attracted Ghazis, warriors of the faith, who were ready to attack Byzantine lands and saw this as part of a holy mission. Yet his success did not lie in conquest alone. Osman knew how to integrate people of very different origins into his following: Turkic nomads, former Seljuk soldiers, Byzantine defectors, and even Christian peasants to whom he offered protection and a new order. This inclusiveness created a broad base that extended far beyond any ethnic or religious elite. Militarily, Osman relied on the mobility of small cavalry units and the use of surprise attacks, often in difficult terrain. He benefited from the weakness of Byzantine administration in frontier regions, where garrisons were poorly supplied and loyalty was unstable. Towns such as Karakahisar and later Yenişehir fell under his control, and around 1302 he defeated a Byzantine army at the Battle of Beyphus, a symbolic victory that established his reputation as a serious power. Unlike many other beys of his time, Osman laid down a clear dynastic structure. He understood that lasting rule could not rest on personal glory alone, but required institutions. Thus he laid the foundation for administrative structures that would later be expanded by his successors. In tradition, he was soon stylized as the founding father of a sacred project, a ruler to whom a divine dream had foretold the expansion of his empire across 3 continents. This dream began to be fulfilled under his son Orhan, who continued the conquests and extended Ottoman power into Europe. Yet it was Osman's ability to transform a small frontier principality into a stable and expanding rule that formed the real cornerstone of the Ottoman Empire's rise. Like Romulus in Roman mythology, or Rurik in the history of the Rus, he used an age of upheaval to create a new order that endured long after his death. A local leader became a name that centuries later still flew on the banners of a world empire. If one looks today from the Turkish west coast across the Aegean Sea, one sees not only glittering waves but also an invisible bridge of history, culture, and indeed blood. Turks and Greeks have been neighbors, allies, rivals, and at times bitter enemies for more than 1,000 years. Yet beneath the surface of political conflict there flows a deeper connection, rooted in genes as much as in the traditions of both peoples. When the first Turkish tribes entered Anatolia in the 11th century, they encountered a land that had for centuries been part of the Greek-Byzantine world. Cities, villages, churches, and markets bore the stamp of Hellenism, and the population spoke Greek, practiced Mediterranean agriculture, and lived a life oriented toward the sea. The Seljuks, and later the Ottomans, brought with them their own language, religion, and administrative order. Yet living together led to a constant interpenetration of both cultures. During the centuries of Ottoman rule, Greeks were not merely subjects but also important actors in the empire. They provided merchants, diplomats, translators, and craftsmen, and in the coastal cities, foods, music, and crafts blended. Even the cuisines of both countries still carry traces of this symbiosis, from stuffed vine leaves to sweets such as baklava and coffee rituals. But this closeness was never free of tension. The Greek War of Independence in the early 19th century and the conflicts that followed left deep wounds. The most painful break came with the compulsory population exchange agreed in 1923. About 1.3 million Greeks left Turkey, while about 400,000 Muslims were repatriated to Turkey from Greece. Entire villages were emptied and resettled, and families lost, within a single generation, the homeland in which they had long been rooted. Despite these tragic chapters, the relationship between Turks and Greeks remains one of the clearest examples of how closely linked neighboring peoples can be, culturally, historically, and biologically. It was movingly demonstrated again in 1999, when a devastating earthquake struck Turkey, and Greece was among the first countries to send rescue teams and aid. When Greece itself was hit by an earthquake a year later, Turkey returned the help. For a moment, the long list of conflicts receded into the background, and it became clear how close both peoples still are despite everything. Anyone standing today on the Galata Bridge in Istanbul sees not only fishermen holding their lines above the water and ferries crossing the Golden Horn, one also sees a symbolic line that does not merely divide water, but connects continents, Europe and Asia. Hardly any other country embodies the role of a bridge between East and West as much as today's Turkey, geographically, culturally, and politically. With its position on two continents, Turkey is not only a crossroads of trade routes, but also a meeting point of ideas, religions, and ways of life. In the streets of Istanbul, one can move within minutes from an Ottoman mosque to a neoclassical building from the era of the Republic, from a bazaar full of spices and fabrics to a modern shopping center with international brands. This coexistence of tradition and modernity has become part of the national identity. Politically, Turkey occupies a special position. As a member of NATO since 1952, it is firmly integrated into Western security structures. At the same time, it maintains close relations with the states of the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. This dual role is both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, it enables Turkey to act as a mediator in international conflicts. On the other hand, it repeatedly leads to tensions between the expectations of its Western partners and its own regional interests. Economically, Turkey has changed dramatically in recent decades. Cities such as Ankara, Izmir, and Bursa have become industrial centers, while tourist regions along the Mediterranean and Aegean coasts attract millions of visitors. Yet the economy remains vulnerable to political uncertainty and global crises, a balancing act between growth and stability, much like the political balancing act between East and West. Culturally, this bridging function is reflected in countless ways: in music that blends Anatolian melodies with Western harmonies, in cuisine that unites influences from the Levant, the Balkans, and Central Europe, and in literature, where writers such as Orhan Pamuk explore the tensions and connections between tradition and modernity, East and West, home and foreignness. But this role as a bridge is not merely a romantic image. It requires constant negotiation between religious and secular forces, between the desire for integration into the European Union and the urge to remain an independent regional power. Compared with its own history, it is striking that Turkey has always lived at crossroads, in the time of the Hittites, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, and now as a republic. The challenge lies in using this position not only geographically, but also intellectually, as a place of exchange, understanding, and innovation. When we let this long and winding journey pass once more before our inner eye, from the frozen plains of the Altai over the caravan routes of the Silk Road, from the splendid palaces of the Seljuks to the domes and minarets of Istanbul, we recognize that the history of the Turks does not follow straight lines. It is a mosaic of encounters and conflicts, of integration and distinction, of the heritage of many peoples who met and became intertwined here. Perhaps this is precisely the greatest strength of this nation, the ability to create unity out of diversity without entirely losing the memory of its different roots. In their DNA as well as in their culture, the Turks carry a history that shows how people can adapt, renew themselves, and nevertheless develop a shared identity. In this field of tension between East and West, between past and future, there lies not only the history of one people, but also a message for all of us, that bridges built between people can be stronger than the walls that divide them. If, on this journey, you discovered moments that moved you, surprised you, or made you reflect, then I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Which stage of this history fascinated you the most? What parallels do you perhaps see with other nations?